Thank you so much for being here with us for our third installation and our final visit with our friends from CODAworx to celebrate the CODAawards. I'm Marcy Reed. I'm with the Architects Foundation, and we are happy to be hosting this with CODAworx today. We are the philanthropic partner of the American Institute of Architects, and our mission is to attract, inspire, and invest in the next generation design community to have positive impact in the world. And the place of inspiration where we normally would have this CODA Award exhibit is the Octagon Museum in Washington, D.C. Since 2016, we have been privileged to join CODAworx to celebrate these awards. And the CODAawards, in case you're not familiar, celebrate the projects that most successfully integrate commissioned art into interior, architectural, and public spaces. And again, because of the pandemic, the Octagon is closed to the public right now, but we're so thrilled with the participation we've been able to garner in these online events that goes far beyond the audience that could join us inside the building itself. And I see we've got people from Philadelphia, we've got people from New York. Fantastic. Thank you for being with us. And I am pleased to turn over the program now to Nicole Carroll, the Vice President of Business Development for CODAworx, who is going to moderate our session today on the Raza Interactive Experience. And she will introduce our panelists to you and get things started. Thank you again for being here.
Thank you so much, Marcy and the Octagon and your whole staff. I appreciate all the work you guys do. So the Raza Interactive Experience, created by Susan Narduli, won the 2020 CODA Award in the institutional category. It was also awarded the 2019 Creative Communications Gold Award in User Experience Design. I'd like to introduce our panelists to you now. Artist and architect Susan Narduli, Creative Director of Narduli Studio. Susan is a Los Angeles-based artist and architect who works at the intersection of art, technology, and public space. She imagines a future based on the synergistic evolution of physical and virtual environments, creating projects that make visible a new typology of public space. At her creative core is a belief in the promise of the sentient built environment, exploring the boundaries of technology, human engagement, and meaning to create works in which the individual becomes the catalyst within an emergent language of engagement. Dr. Amy Scott, the Executive Vice President and Research and Interpretation, and the Marilyn B. and Calvin B. Gross Curator of Visual Arts at the Autry Museum. Amy has curated several of the Autry's signature exhibitions and core galleries, including Yosemite, Art of the American Icon, Art of the West, La Raza, and many others. She has contributed to a number of books and catalogs on the art of the American West, including the exhibition catalog La Raza, published by RC Press, which was awarded a gold medal in the category of U.S. history in the 2020 Independent Publisher Book Awards. And it also won the International Latino Book Awards. And it's pretty exciting because there's going to be a drawing for one of these books at the end of our discussion this evening. Luis Garza began his artistic career as a photojournalist, recording the tumultuous social events of the 1960s and 70s for La Raza magazine, the journalistic voice of the Chicano Civil Rights Movement in Los Angeles. He serves as co-curator of the critically acclaimed La Raza exhibition at the Autry Museum of the American West, where his contributions facilitated the acquisition of this vast 30,000 plus historical collection of film negatives now housed at the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center, thus furthering the collaborative efforts between La Raza photographic staff members and the Autry Museum within the Getty Initiative of Pacific Standard Time, Latin America, Los Angeles. Welcome, my panelists. To provide everyone with some background about this particular project, From September of 2017 through January of 2018, more than 70 cultural institutions participated in Pacific Standard Time LALA, a 4-month-long exploration of the rich past and vast, vital present of Latin America and Latino art. As part of the Pacific Standard Time LALA initiative, Narduli Studio was commissioned to create an interactive experience for the Autry Museum's La Raza exhibition. From 1967 to 1977, La Raza, which is translated the people, the Latin people, first an underground newspaper, later a photojournalistic magazine, provided a voice for the Chicano Rights movement as it unfolded across Los Angeles and beyond. In the exhibition, more than 25,000 images captured by the La Raza photographers bear witness to this struggle for social justice. Most of the images had never been seen prior to this exhibition. Narduli Studio was commissioned to bring the exhibition to life. Let's take a look at the video now. Beautiful. Thank you so much. Luis, I want to start with you. It's so exciting to have you one of the La Raza photographers who captured the social struggle from 1967 to 1977, when La Raza went from being a bilingual mimeograph, which some people on the call probably don't even realize, mimeographed newspaper produced in the basement of the Episcopalian Church, to a photojournalistic magazine featuring well-crafted silver emulsion black and white photographs. As one of the photographers who recovered 18 binders full of over 25,000 photographic negatives from La Raza, this must have been an incredible personal journey of discovery and renewal and reconnecting with colleagues and images from over 40 years ago. Clearly, you recognize the historical importance of this photographic collection. And I'm curious, how did you immediately reach out to UCLA's Chicano Studies, their research center, to discuss archiving the collection? Or tell us a little bit about that journey.
The process of recovering the negatives and contact sheets was one of individual photographers who wanted access to their imagery and their photographs personally. Once we retrieved the collection that was in the hands of the late co-editor Raul Ruiz, they were shared with us at the basement of Joe Russell, who was also a co-editor of La Raza. And so as we began to go through the files, we began to realize that we had something much larger here than individual photographers, as so much as an entire collection. And that meant a lot to us in terms of trying to preserve the entirety of it and keep it in the spirit of what we did back in those years. And so we began to look around to archival sources. Where could we and whom could we work with in terms of the images that we had here? So we began an investigation and an interview process with many different archival sources. Bakersfield, San Bernardino, UCLA, USC, a number of organizations and repositories that we were looking at. We finally settled on UCLA, Chicano Studies Research Center, much because of the reputation that they had in doing this kind of work, and also because a number of us were students from UCLA. So there was a camaraderie, and that began the process. And so when we began to transfer the negative books to UCLA, Chicano Studies Research Center, I received a phone call from Chon Noriega, the director at that time, who's just recently moved on. And he said, I think that we may have an exhibition here. And what was that exhibition? Well, it was the beginnings of the Getty Pacific Standard Time LA initiative. And that then opened up the door further and say, okay, where would we hold this exhibition? Which led us to the Autry Museum and Amy Scott and the newly appointed director, Rick West, who I think this was probably one of his first projects. He was being installed the very day that I met with Amy when I came to introduce myself. And so that began the process when Amy came over to UCLA and we began looking at the archive collection. And the steps began, the process began. And Autry submitted a proposal to the Getty, and those steps just evolved until we had an exhibition in the works and the makings. And Amy can go into further detail when you speak to Amy about that.
Terrific, terrific. And how did you personally get involved with La Raza as a young 20-something photographer, New York native?
Karma.
Karma, I love it.
Serendipity, fate, call it what you will.
Okay.
I was parachuted into the Chicano movement because I was desperate for a job, and I met a guy who flipped my worldview. His name was Ed Bonilla, and he was the director of a program called NAP, a neighborhood adult participation project, which was part of the Great Society initiated by Lyndon Johnson at the time. And so in my desperation and looking for work, I entered his office. I was introduced by some friends, and I had my camera with me, as I always carried it. And he looked at me and he said, so you're from New York? I go, yeah. He goes, and you're Puerto Rican? I go, no, I'm Mexican. My family is from Mexico. I said, but yeah, I'm Puerto Rican. I'm Jewish, I'm Irish, I'm Polish, I'm all of those things that New York is by osmosis. And then he said to me, and you need a job? I said, yes, I need a job. He says, a Chicano from New York. Now, I had never heard the word Chicano. And I thought to myself, Mexicano, Chicano? Yeah, I'm a Chicano from New York. And then he said to me, all right, you got the job. I said, great, what's the job? He said, you're gonna organize the people. I said, how do you do that? He said, well, you bring your camera with you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock and we're gonna start. I said, okay. And that's how it started. And naively and innocently by me in 1968, late 68, 69, I was introduced into the Chicano movement when I met co-editors who just became co-editors, Raul Ruiz and Joe Raso, Father Luce, and a host of other people in the burgeoning Chicano movement that was taking place. So that began my photographic documentation of the Chicano movement, and actually my career path. My razón de ser came to be when I was introduced into the Chicano movement, and continues to this day.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that story with us. So, Susan, you were commissioned to bring 25,000 photographic images to life in an interactive experience for the Autry Museum's La Raza exhibition, visualizing the vast archive, as well as developing a practical system for navigation and research. You gave the viewers of the La Raza exhibition an opportunity to immerse themselves in a virtual space within the museum gallery's physical space. And as a practicing architect and artist, how did you begin the process of figuring out a system to organize and present the La Raza photo collection in such a compelling manner?
Thank you, Nicole. I'll just start by saying it's really an honor to be here with everyone today. And that's a great question. I'll start by saying that this project was a collaboration with many people, but primarily with UCLA, the Chicano Research Center, the Autry, and the photographers, and most prominently with Luis Garza. The relationship between architecture and creating physical spaces as an architect and creating virtual spaces, there are definitely parallels there. And these are parallels that I've been pushing those boundaries of for, I think, most of my career. My training as an architect has certainly informed how I approach the design of virtual spaces. And it had a big impact on how I approach this 3D navigation environment that we created for Raza. I know that there are probably some architecture students here, and so for you, I think you'll probably understand this, but when you begin a project as an architect, you start with programming phase, and that programming phase has to do with starting to think about and organize the requirements for a project. Well, it's the same thing when you're creating a virtual environment. In fact, we call it information architecture. You start putting together the structure for the piece, and you start to organize the assets and the sequencing and how the software is going to work. And that all goes together into like a diagram. And from that, you can develop storyboards and all kinds of stuff. But it's very similar to architecture in that there is an overall structure, a programming structure for the development of a piece. And then just to take it a little bit further, and I know we'll get into this later, but the design process is very similar as well. because as architects go from schematic design to design development into construction documents where everything gets specified, you figure it all out. It's the same thing. I actually think Amy might say it's the same thing for curating an exhibition, because you're dealing with those same issues that you do in architecture. And those issues are, issues of scale, experience. What is the experience you're creating, the narrative, and of course, aesthetics. So I guess I'll just, sum it up by saying that I definitely see this synchronicity between architecture and physical world and creating virtual spaces. And I think we have all experienced this now, because as virtual experiences come into our public physical spaces, which is a lot of what our practice does now, you see this this merging of these two very distinct ways of understanding space and environment experience.
Thank you. Megan has a video. It's actually one of Susan's videos. Do you want to say anything about this intro screen video, Susan?
Well, I think this is this was just a little teaser. This is the it's a little clip from what we would call the fly-through universe of La Raza. And if you stay with it for a minute, I think it'll evolve from particles to photographs.
Great.
It's a little choppy on my screen, and it might be on yours too. As great as Zoom is, it's not flawless. So this is the La Raza universe. And actually all those little rectangles that are starting to come into view a little bit, those are photographs that, that we put into the particle structure.
We'll talk a little bit about the navigation in a
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's laggy, Nicole. I think it's playing. It's going to take a long time maybe to finish. So, do you want to move on?
Okay. So I know that you imagine the archive as a living ecosystem and the digital interactive as a neural universe, which we just saw a glimpse of, where long-term memory effectively acts as a dynamic knowledge base similar to the human neural system. It places the viewer within the broader context of the Chicano movement during this moment in history and brings an understanding of the relevance to personal expression, politics, and media culture at the time. The UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center scanned and cataloged the 25,000 photographs and negatives and developed the database index. And your studio conceptualized a framework for viewers to interact with the archive as a living neural ecosystem. And do you want to talk a little bit about that first, or should we take a peek at that navigation video?
Why don't we see how the navigation video plays first, so people can see it, and then I'll respond to. So at the end of the video, you see the beautiful exhibition at the Autry, and the touch screens were kind of in the central area of the exhibition. So Nicole, I can just jump in and talk about the neural structure. Yeah,
That sounds great. Yes.
okay. So what seems kind of obvious now, looking at something after the fact, as usual, you know, it's oftentimes a long time in the making. And when I was talking earlier about the organization of the piece, I mean, initially we went through many different iterations to come to what became what you just saw, this kind of branching and neural structure. So in creating this piece, if you kind of step back, we not only had to imagine a way of visualizing big data, which 25,000 to 30,000 images with all the metadata, that's a lot of data. But we also needed to develop a practical system for navigation and research. We saw this, we really saw this as an opportunity. We fell in love with the project. We started to collaborate with Roster Software Lab on thinking through how we could even handle all of this data. And we had this amazing, this extraordinary, powerful body of work. And we didn't want to bog everything down with all of this data and not be able to appreciate the work itself. So as we started to, kind of get into the project, it became really clear to us that to truly understand the archive, what was important was to understand the connections between the photographs and the context of what was going on in that time in Los Angeles. And metaphorically, we began to visualize the archive as you might think of a grassroots movement, which really, that's what it was. That's what was happening in LA. There was a grassroots social and political and economic movement that was happening. And that became the visual for the interactive. When we talk about a neural structure, that's more of a software terminology, but it does kind of look like, if you think about a grassroots, like what one would imagine, that it does look like the neural structure, and that the idea for the neural network and using the neural network algorithms to map out the architect, that gave us the opportunity to pull from machine learning and pattern recognition and create a network that was very specific, very unique to Raza archive, and that would also allow us to not only bring this archive to life, but as people began to engage with the archive, that information, as you're in there, as you're selecting things and moving through and navigating, all that information becomes part of the archive, and it starts to inform and bring out new connections within it. That was relatively new in 2017. That kind of machine learning pattern recognition is much more pervasive today, but we're pretty much on the cutting edge of what one could do with technology in developing this concept of neural structure.
So in other words, if I am coming to the table and interacting with the exhibition, I see what other people have done previously before I got there, and then they'll see what I added to it, how I did the search and things like that. Is that exactly how it works, or?
You wouldn't, it's not quite as direct as that, Nicole. You wouldn't see it. It would inform it. So that over time, the piece evolves. You have to think of it more that way. Like a grassroots movement, it takes time. And you start to draw, connect bridges, new synapses appear. It's like that. And over time, the piece evolves.
Okay, wonderful. So you talked a little bit about the user interface, which is actually very exciting, and it gives the viewers kind of a tour guide for time travel through the digital interactive ecosystem. And I know that it's multi-layered, and you can, there are 4 different unique experiences that the user can select to interface with it. Flight, spectrum, timeline, deep dive. And maybe the best thing to do is play the video that shows
Sure.
those 4 experiences first, and then you can comment on them.
So I think we've touched a little bit on some of this before. One of the experiences is called Flight, and it's a fly through of the entire archive. And when the interactive is in, like we call it passive mode, when nobody's on it, that's like the default experience. And I think the longer video, you could actually see that as you step back, you see all these moving images, and that's the fly through. The timeline, that it's a chronological organization of the archive, and spectrum is quantitative. If you think of every photograph, it's got all of these, like all this metadata associated with it, all kinds of indexes, and it organizes the archive based on all of those indexes and the quantitative analysis of that. And deep dive is the neural structure we were talking about with all of the connections. And just one note about, this was an art commission, more or less, and CODA is giving this award as an art commission, I suppose. And from the beginning, our intention was to create an art interaction. But this was also a tool for directed research. And we wanted to create a new platform that could expand upon how researchers might typically explore an archive, because we actually felt that by kind of breaking through traditional ways, by allowing researchers to see all these connections, and it might open up a new way of understanding what was going on here in LA. You know how they say that oftentimes history is defined by the books the kids get in school? Well, for researchers, what are their tools? And we really were excited about the possibilities of using these new technologies, neural network structures, to be able to bring a new way of, for somebody to actually kind of dig in, see everything, and also do some research and be informed in a new way. Our earliest visualizations of this were amazing, and because we got to see the hidden structure of the archive materialize. It was a beautiful moment for everybody that had been working on this for so long. And this was a unique ecosystem with an intelligence that was born out of the logic of the Raza archive.
And the archive was tagged at UCLA. Luis, were you, I believe, and also Amy, were pretty involved in the meta tags and so forth of what people were looking at and when they were photographed. Is that right?
Yeah, and it was even more expansive than that, because one of the things that Amy creatively came up with was at the computer table itself in the exhibition, there were data cards for people who were going through the computer system. And so people could add to the information base, because there was no centralized system of the metadata. I mean, our record keeping back in the day was not as cohesive or not as expansive or detailed. And so it was a gathering of the information. And so all of those cards that people wrote, well, this name, this file, And then Amy and the Autry would transfer that over to Javiera Flores over at the Chicano Studies Library. And the metadata was inputted. And then people started getting into it in terms of inputting the information to help, since they were participants and part of this history, whether directly or indirectly. This was part of the embracing aspect of the exhibition, in that it draws the viewer into a family. It draws them into an expanded family that they begin to identify whomever it is that they see. And here's the card, fill it out. And that's how we began. That's how we put it. Amy can elaborate on that further.
Sure. I didn't have a huge role in assembling the metadata, other than, what was gathered out of the gallery, mainly because I'm not a historian of Chicano culture. But my main task within the archive and working with Louise and then Susan was to really sort of get into what was that visual logic and what was the visual language that the archive was using to articulate the concerns, the arguments that Chicanos had in the 1960s and throughout the course of the Chicano movement. And how did the archive as a group of images in a vast sort of one at that, how did it come up with these visual, and highly persuasive arguments basically for social justice and equality. And also, as the movement grew, of course, its concerns evolved. And so how did the archive, not just offer a visual timeline, but sort of morph and evolve with the movement itself and through the work of multiple photographers over a span of time. So we came up with a handle of themes. I won't go through all of them, but they included things like, and this is how sort of the gallery itself, found resonance and meaning when we were still only able to include, 200 some images out of 25,000 that we could print and frame on the walls. And we did it floor to ceiling in a lot of spaces. They're just, so we really used the space that we had well, but sort of sussing out what those themes were that collectively spoke to the evolving issues and concerns of the Chicano community and arguments that they were making for inclusion, in the American project. Was what Louise and I spent most of our time, I would say, working on. And so, for example, they included some of the more compelling sections of the exhibition were things like the portraits of a community, which really were intimate moments of families, communities, gatherings, meal times, hearings, sit-ins, kids at school, meetings inside people's homes. So it was a very intimate sort of cross-section of the exhibition that spoke to the Chicano community, not just as a group of sort of angry young men, but as a really complex, nuanced, inclusive community. And that was but one. There were weddings, there were meetings, there were, all sorts of like intimate moments between friends and couples and families and kids that really, I think, painted a much more sort of nuanced picture of the Chicano community than certainly was given up in the mainstream media by a long stretch. Other, I think, powerful sections included things like The Other in the State, which is really about police brutality. One of the things that the archive did beautifully is to take images of how sort of a militarized police force was often deployed to contain, surround, and intimidate activists and events, and really sort of turning the camera back on the state, I think reversing, a century's worth of sort of otherizing of ethnic communities by white majorities and sort of power structures. So that was fascinating. And then it came to, we figured out, I think, perhaps, midway when we started to get a handle on what some of the themes were and just how vast and, deep the archive was, and really we're talking about how to convey the complexity of the archive to the visitor, who might just be in that gallery once and might only have the 200 some images to really understand the archive in its entirety. And that's when we came up with the idea of some sort of interactive, of course, that would show more than what was on the wall, and sort of let people explore it in greater depth and at their leisure, and cross-reference photographers with events, with, you know, some of the organizers and the themes of the exhibit, etc. And our exhibition designer at the time was like, well, what if we don't, you know, what if we do not just, you know, 500 or 1,500, but all 25,000? And soon our exhibition producer, our media producer at the time, put us in touch with Susan, and Susan and Sebastian over at Narduli came up with these structures that you've seen, which are just, in addition to just being visually elegant, and easy and sort of fun to explore, I think really mirror in their visuality and the ways in which you engage with them, the complexity and the nuances of the archive, and just how many places and events and sequences and scenes and years and issues and spaces within Los Angeles and different communities that the archive, you know, touches on or engage directly with. And yeah, so I mean, I've never, in my 20-some years of curatorial practice, you know, I've seen anybody devise an exhibition interactive like this one, that somehow, and it still is sort of magical to me how it works and came to life, managed to really speak to such a density of images and of history. By visually weaving together and mapping out the intersections, the players, the dates, the events, and just the layers, the depth and the nuance of the archive in its entirety, which is considerable. It was quite a feat.
So thank you for filling all that in. You were talking with me a couple of weeks ago. You were talking about the impact the exhibition had, that you have a lot of students coming through, and that basically they come to your museum as their history class. And I believe it's a grade school as well as high schoolers. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And tell us a little bit about the impact of the exhibition on those students, and you know, what you observed.
Yeah, and you know, Louise can talk to this as well. There were various levels of engagement. I think, you know, at the sort of center of it was the figure of Joe Raza, who was one of the original editors and organizers of the Chicano Movement, and editors and founders of the Raza magazine. And he is a very sort of literal mind that just absorbs information. And he spent hours and hours in the exhibit, you know, on a weekly basis, just going through and sort of mentally and on a notepad, like cataloging the images and figuring out where there were discrepancies, and, you know, and he would just sort of give spontaneous, you know, tours to people who happened to come into the exhibition. I mean, can you imagine walking into an exhibition of Chicano history and all of a sudden you're sort of getting a walkthrough from one of its originators? And so that was incredible. And he wasn't the only one of sort of the original organizers and photographers who came in and spent considerable time with it. We had graduates, you know, graduate seminars come in. We had smaller, younger kids come in, I think as young as 9 to 11, middle school age, which is a lot of our school tours. But I think the most interesting and sort of, at least for me, rewarding group to kind of witness engaging with it were the teenagers and the high school students. Because that is, you know, that is an age, I think, when kids are starting to realize their impact or their potential impact in the world. I don't know of a lot of opportunities that kids that young, and especially brown kids of that age, have the chance to see themselves on museum walls. And, you know, the Chicano movement was launched with the East LA walkouts by high school students in 1968. So to see them as, you know, sort of the actual, you know, sort of protagonists of this story, which had both become the source of great art and, you know, sort of this momentous moment in our national history. you know, it was really fun just to watch them get up close, watch them talk to their parents, their friends, their teachers, point at images, you know, sort of dissect and discuss them. And, you know, that was really fun to see them physically engaging with the show. And of course the interactives, in a way that just transcended how people of any age or demographic typically interact with museum exhibitions, which is to sort of look at a painting for 30 seconds and then move on to the next, right? It was not that experience at all. And, you know, the interactive was critical and sort of, it was a critical component of bringing that to life. So that was probably the most rewarding part for me.
And Luis, you had mentioned to me also about the multi-generational dialogues that you were seeing happening, grandparents talking to grandkids who perhaps the grandkids didn't know that their grandparents had been involved with the Chicano movement.
Well, yes, and that's to add to what Amy just said, which was so important an aspect of this exhibition, and that it crosses all generational, gender, political. There were those who agreed or disagreed just based on the fact that we use the word La Raza. There were others who thought it was, they were red baiting. They did not see the politics beyond their own politics. And so the imposition of their own political viewpoints upon the exhibition was interesting, because that became the challenge and that became the dialogue, which to me was part of how the evolution of La Raza magazine came to be. Mm-hmm. Journalism is dialogue, so let's engage in dialogue. And so that begins the story of how we begin to bring together my fellow colleagues from the past and tracking them down and searching for them. Some have passed away, some are in bad health, some, the backstory to this is phenomenal. It's several cases of wine and tequila, but that story was fascinating. And those are the things that I shared with Amy and my fellow colleagues, who at first were disbelieving that this was actually happening or could happen, and then slowly came along as they began to realize that, yes, indeed, it was happening. So the introduction by Laura Purdy to Susan Narduli, 6 months before the opening, which is another incredible aspect of this exhibition in terms of how Susan came in on such short notice. And I have the original date of when we met, so we can verify that, Amy and I and Susan. And what Amy mentioned in terms of the hundreds of images that we put up on the wall was what we had to work with, which was only several thousands at that time that was scanned and digitized. The entire collection is not like all of a sudden, you know, overnight you scan it and you digitize and that's it. No, we were working with what we had against a deadline opening. We had a timeline. So when Susan enters with this computer system, how many can you load up? Well, Susan can best answer that. Some 5,000 to 10,000 that were loaded up by opening night. And then thereafter, it's loading in more and loading in more, loading in more, developing the metadata base and expanding upon the narrative, which that emotional narrative that Susan tapped into was my dream state every night, because I had to go through the entire collection half a dozen times to sort through the curatorial process. And so I became familiar, very familiar with the work of my fellow colleagues, and I give all due respect to my fellow colleagues, and I was not aware of the extent of their personal work. I was aware because I did so much darkroom work for everybody, but I became even more aware through this process. And so I became intimate. And so every night in my dream state, that neurological connection that Susan tapped into was what I was living day after day and still continue, because I wake up in the middle of the night connecting those neurological dots.
Wow.
Simple as that. It's a fascinating process. It's a very emotional process because I keep on reliving. I keep on going down memory lane, which is not a memory. It's very present. It's past, is present, is future. And it still goes on.
Wow. I want to leave a few minutes to open questions to the audience. Amanda, do we have questions in the chat?
Not yet.
Okay, if anybody would like to ask anything, or if Susan or Amy or Luis, if there's anything else that you want to add that we haven't touched upon, please do.
Actually, there was one question I saw in the chat about from George Miller that I think is a good tie-in to what Luis was just talking about, which is a little more about kind of the impact of the movement and La Raza on society and some of the outcomes from the effort and the work.
Do you want me to respond to that?
Yes, please.
If you look at that period of the 1960s and 70s, which was revolutionary worldwide, that was the time of great upheaval, civil strife throughout the world, in Europe and Latin America, and here in the United States. We were at odds with each other in this country over the Vietnam War in particular, which was a unifying aspect of conflict that drew many from the left progressive wings of American political and cultural. You also had the feminist movement, you had the Indian movement, AIM, you had the gay movement, you had any number of movements that were going on at that time. The La Raza, the Chicano movement, comes out of a post-World War II Korean War. That generation of us comes out of that World War II Korean War, and we go from Mexican American to Chicano. And we're self-branding, we're self-identifying. We're not complacent. We, like others, be they the feminist movement, gay movement, black movement, whatever, are looking, as we continue to do to this day. It ain't over. And so you see the legacy of that time from the 60s and 70s, which everybody refers to as a pivotal and a turning point in American history. And the aftershocks, the afterwaves, the ripple effects of that period of time still resonates to this day. You can see that with Texas laws, voter suppression, women's rights, to abortion, to any of the other environmental issues that are going on to this day. But when you look at Chicanos, Mexicanos, who constitute 40 to 60 million people within this country, it's a diaspora of Latin Americans, of particularly Mexicans in this country. And the impact is profound. The demographic changes are impacting the culture and the politics of this country, which is part of the backlash that we are facing. And that will not be resolved. That's going to continue. And the conflict and the strife is still going to be there. So when I look back at what we were doing, it's not over. It's just a continuation for all of us.
Yeah.
In our various political and cultural attitudes.
Yeah.
You know, to me, this whole issue about critical race theory, well, La Raza and what we were doing our version of critical race theory. And what Amy was talking about in terms of looking at the young people who are coming in to look at the exhibition, they're seeing a piece of their history that is not in the history books, you see? And so that's important. And that is across this country with all the various demographics that are responding. They're not going to take it anymore. You know, what's that saying out of that movie? What was that movie? I'm not going to take it anymore. And that's what it was. That's what it is.
It continues. Amanda, thank you, Luis. Amanda, are there a couple of other questions?
So in the spirit of continuing, has there been any interest in touring the exhibit to other museums? And is there a chance that this can tour?
There has been, and there still is, although we're struggling to find the resources, frankly, to put behind it. So, but yes, although I don't have a definitive answer to that. I would like to point out also relative to Louise's comment that this show opened in the fall of 2017, when many of us were still sort of reeling from the election of Donald Trump, and the issues that were coming out, or the kinds of language that was coming out of the highest places, specifically aimed at Mexicans and Mexican Americans. And it was, that talking about sort of like living history and sort of the ongoing impact. We could not have predicted that in a million years, because of course we began the exhibition long before the election was underway or he had the nomination. But it just had this sort of incredible resonance that, to me, and I'm just speaking personally, had sort of acted a little bit like a salve over sort of the wounds of the present, realizing that the history, had given us sort of a path forward in the now. It had an oddly sort of reassuring nature to it. At least it did for me. And the timing of it was just, there was a surrealism to it that I think made it a little more compelling and provocative, because you could see it unfolding again in a lot of ways.
Yeah. And to that, I would say that if we were to hold that exhibition now and open it now, it would still resonate as much as it did before, because the issues then that were contained within the exhibition speak to the issues that are current today. And so the juxtaposition, the irony of it is that that's what people related to in looking at the imagery, looking at this exhibition. They find common ground.
Fingers crossed you'll find additional funding to tour it. I know we're pressed right up against our time just about. Amanda, did you want to field one more question, or where should we stop?
I don't have any other questions that have come through the chat, but feel free, all of our participants, feel free to ask any final questions. But while we're waiting on that, I'm going to do the giveaway, which is for a signed copy of the La Raza book that is in that is about the exhibition, and it'll be signed by Amy and Luis. And the winner of that is, drumroll please.
Drumroll.
Cheryl Foster.
Yay.
Congratulations. We'll be following up after.
And, if I could just give a brief plug to the publication itself. They're available at the Autry store. I think they're on Amazon. There's a bunch of copies left because it didn't come out until after the exhibition closed for a variety of reasons, but it has also in the time since won a whole slew of awards. It's been one of the most successful publications that the museum has ever done, certainly. And it's a really important book.
Thank you, Amy. I dropped the link in the chat, and I'm also dropping the link in the chat to our exhibition for CODAwards, which will be up through September 30th online. So please check out this project and other projects as well.
And I just want to say thank you to Susan and Amy and Luis and the Octagon. Thank you so much for sharing this very important and engaging project with the world. And you can always visit it on CODAworx or the Architects Foundation website, or Susan Narduli's website, or the museum's website, I would imagine. And I thank you very much for coming this evening.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Likewise. Thank you much.
Bye.
Adios, everyone.
Bye-bye.